All right, so here is part 2 of today's video. I didn't want to make that first one incredibly long. So fractions, decimals, and percents. When we're reviewing fractions, decimals, and percents, they go together because they're just so connected. All right, I want you to think about this. If I had the fraction 1/4, okay, I know that 1/4 can also be said as 1/4. Think about that, 1/4 of something. Because when I'm looking at something broken up into fourths, right, there's the 1/4, 1/4 of it. A quarter in money is the same as 0.25. How you get to that is by dividing. Remember that fraction bar also means division. I can take 1/4 and I can turn that into 1 divided by 4. And when I do that and I do the division, 2, 8, subtract, bring down. Remember, you can keep adding zeros after that decimal, it doesn't matter. Oops, I put the wrong number there. 5, that's where your 0.25 comes from. All right, then, so here's my fraction, here's my decimal. I want to turn that into a percent. Well, think about the way you read that fraction, that decimal. If I were to read that decimal, I would read that decimal as 25 hundredths, right? When I have 0.25, I read that as 25 hundredths. Anything out of 100, that's your percent. So that's the same as saying 25%. So that would be 25%, okay? Another way to think about that, let me get rid of all of this over here. Go, go, go. All right, there we go. Another way to think about the changing into that percent. If I was at, come on, pen. If I was still back at my 1/4, remember, I can take any fraction, and if I can turn it into something over 100, I know I've got my percent. 4 times 25, remember it takes 4 quarters to make a dollar. 4 times 25 is 100. 1 times 25 gives me 25 hundredths. Right there. The way I say this is my decimal, and then because I have it out of 100, there's my percent. All right, so there's fraction, decimal, percent. If I'm going back and forth, now let's clear this off a little bit here. Let's say I wasn't given the fraction to start with. Let's say I had been given the percent. Any percent, remember, it can be written over 100. So you take whatever number's in the front and write it as that. Another option. See why I made this a separate video? It would have been incredibly long. Another option is to think about this. If I have 25%, I know the decimal is right back here. Anytime I have a whole number, I know the decimal is behind it. Right? To go from fraction to from percent to decimal and decimal to percent, all you gotta do really is think about your alphabet. When I say my alphabet, right, A, B, C, D, and then I keep going, and the letter P is all the way down here. Here's my decimal, here's my percent. If I'm going to go from a percent to a decimal, I'm going to move the decimal place 2 places in the problem. That's the same as if I were to divide it by 100. And then that becomes 0.25. If I was doing the opposite and changing from decimal to percent, I would go the other direction 2 places, which is like multiplying it by 100. 1, 2, and then it becomes the 25%. But what if I don't have a number that is so easy and straightforward as 1/4? What if I'm dealing with something like 2/3? 2/3 is weird. Okay. I can't take that 3 and do times something and give me 100. This isn't something I could easily change the same way I changed the 1/4. So this is one you got to think a little bit more about. So let's start with our division. 2 divided by 3. Got to put my decimal point in there. And of course, you're probably using a calculator, and that's okay. 3 into 20 goes 6 times. That's 18. I subtract, I get 2. I can add a 0. And I'm back to the 20 again. Look at what's happening here. I would divide it by 20, it had 20 there, and I'm dividing 20 here. As soon as the same number starts showing up, you know that this is going to be, excuse me, a repeating number, a repeating decimal. So our 2/3 as a decimal is going to be that repeating number. So our 2/3 equals 0.6 repeating. Now how do I write that as a percent then? What do I do if I have something that's repeating and I want to write it as a percent? I'm going to do the same as I did before. If I have 0.6 repeating and I want to go from a decimal to a percent, I'm just going to take that decimal and move it 2 places. 1, 2. Now, normally we would fill these spaces with zeros. Okay, and I'll show you an example of that later. Normally this would be 0, but because it's repeating, we're going to put more of those in there. That looks like a face. Okay, so this as a percent becomes 66.6 repeating percent. All right? Now, if you are getting stuck, okay, feel free to Google a fraction decimal percent chart. They're all over the place. Okay, there are some that show whole lists. Okay, some interesting ones: 7/20, 7/8. Okay, 3/5. That's a good one for us to look at as an example to show you that 0 that I was talking about. If I had our 3/5, okay. Remember, one way we can do this, try turning it into something over 100. 5 times 20, 3 times 20 gives me 60. So that's going to be 60 hundredths, okay, equals 60%. Now, this is the part that I want you to think about, because I could have sorry about that, could have gone from my 3/5. What if it was just written as something over 10? 6 to 10. Okay. Sometimes we don't always get to that 100 right away because we don't realize it. If you had divided the 3 divided by 5, you would have ended up with 0.6. So how does that 0.6, okay, become 60%? Because remember, this 0 back here doesn't have to be there. You can take a 0 off the end of a decimal and it still has the same value. So if I wanted to go from this 0.6 to my 60%, this is what I was talking about in that last problem, that when I move that decimal 2 places, you're filling that empty space with a 0. That's where your 60% comes from. All right? So, to recap, in the video that came before this. I hope you watched that. When you go into today, that video and the quizzes. That's it today. All right. If you have things to get caught up on from other days, please take the time to do that today. And as always, if you have questions, send them to me and I will answer them as quickly as I can. Talk to you later.